Now, when I say fails, I mean fails intellectually. The anguish of the problem of suffering and the gnawing doubts may still remain. And that brings us back to the emotional problem of suffering. And I've already said, I think, that most people who are suffering are not really experiencing an intellectual problem, but rather an emotional problem. Now, you might think it to yourself at this point, well, then why go through all of this intellectual material if it's really not the problem? Well, two reasons, I think. First of all, people think that their problem is intellectual. So by working through the responses to the logical and evidential problems of evil, we can help them to see what the real problem is and treat their opinion with respect. But secondly, I think that what I've shared with you this afternoon can be of tremendous help and encouragement when you yourself are called upon to endure terrible suffering. The health and wealth gospel and the gospel of positive thinking that are being proclaimed in various mega churches and denominations in this country are false gospels that are setting people up for a fall. That kind of health and wealth gospel won't preach in Darfur or North Korea or Iraq or 1,000 other places. And if it won't preach there, it's not the true gospel. We need to understand that God's plan for humanity may involve terrible suffering for us, whose point or reason we can't expect to see. Our hope lies not in worldly happiness, but rather in that day when God will wipe away every tear. So, what can be said to those who are struggling with the emotional problem of suffering? Well, in one sense, the most important thing may not be what you say at all. The most important thing may be to just be there as a loving friend and a sympathetic listener, to just be there to lend emotional support. But some people may want counsel, and we ourselves might have to deal with this emotional problem when we suffer. So does the Christian faith have the resources to deal with this emotional problem as well? Well, I think it certainly does. Because the Christian faith tells us that God is not some distant creator or impersonal ground of being, but he is a loving heavenly Father who shares our sufferings and who hurts with us. On the cross, Christ endured a suffering beyond all understanding. He bore the punishment for the sins of the whole world. None of us can comprehend that suffering. Even though he was innocent, he voluntarily took upon himself the death penalty of sin that we deserved. If anyone could complain of innocent suffering, it would have been Jesus of Nazareth. And why did he do this? He did it because he loves us so much. How can we reject him who was willing to sacrifice everything for us? When God asks us to go through suffering that seems unmerited, pointless, and unnecessary, meditation upon the cross of Christ can help to give us the moral strength and courage needed to bear the cross that we're asked to carry. I mentioned earlier that knowing God is an incommensurable good to which our suffering cannot even be compared. I think few of us truly understand this truth. But a former colleague of mine got to know a woman who did. Tom used to make it his habit to visit shut-ins in a nursing home in an attempt to bring a bit of cheer and happiness into their lives. And one day he met a woman in the nursing home that he would never forget. And this is Tom's account, if I might read it to you. On this particular day, I was walking in a hallway that I had not visited before, looking in vain for a few who were alive enough to receive a flower and a few words of encouragement. This hallway seemed to contain some of the worst cases, strapped onto carts or into wheelchairs and looking completely helpless. As I neared the end of this hallway, I saw an old woman strapped in a wheelchair. Her face was an absolute horror. The empty stare and white pupils of her eyes told me that she was blind. The large hearing aid over one ear told me that she was almost deaf. One side of her face was being eaten by cancer. There was a discolored and running sore covering part of one cheek, and it had pushed her nose to the side, dropped one eye, and distorted her jaw, so that what should have been the corner of her mouth was the bottom of her mouth. As a consequence, she drooled constantly. I also learned that this woman was 89 years old and that she had been bedridden, blind, nearly deaf, and alone for 25 years. This was Mabel. I don't know why I spoke to her. She looked less likely to respond than most of the people I saw in that hallway. But I put a flower in her hand and said, I'm sorry, this is a very emotional story, and said, here's a flower for you. Happy Mother's Day. She held the flower up to her face and tried to smell it, and then she spoke, and much to my surprise, her words, though somewhat garbled because of her deformity, were obviously produced by a clear mind. Thank you, she said, it's lovely. But can I give it to someone else? I can't see, you know, I'm blind. I said, of course. And I pushed her in her chair back down the hallway to a place where I thought I could find some alert patients. I found one and stopped the chair. Mabel held out the flower and said, here, this is from Jesus. It was then that it began to dawn on me that this was not an ordinary human being. Mabel and I became friends over the next few weeks, and I went to see her once or twice a week for the next 3 years. It was not many weeks before I turned from a sense that I was being helpful to a sense of wonder, and I would go to her with a pen and paper and write down the things she would say. During one hectic week of final exams, I was frustrated because my mind seemed to be pulled in 10 directions at once with all of the things that I had to think about. The question occurred to me, what does Mabel have to think about? Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, not even able to know if it's day or night. I went to her and asked her, Mabel, what do you think about as you lie here? And she said, I think about my Jesus. I sat there and thought for a moment about the difficulty for me of thinking about Jesus for even 5 minutes. And I asked her, what do you think about Jesus? She replied slowly and deliberately as I wrote, and this is what she said. I think how good he's been to me. He's been awfully good to me in my life, you know. I'm one of those kind who's mostly satisfied. Lots of folks would think I'm kind of old-fashioned, but I don't care. I'd rather have Jesus. He's all the world to me. And then Mabel began to sing an old hymn. Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my all. He is my strength from day to day. Without him, I would fall. When I am sad, to him I go. No other one can cheer me so. When I am sad, he makes me glad. He's my friend. This is not fiction. Incredible as it may seem, a human being really lived like this. I knew her. How could she do it? Seconds ticked and minutes crawled, and so did days and weeks and months and years of pain without human company and without an explanation of why it was all happening. And she lay there and sang hymns. How could she do it? The answer, I think, is that Mabel had something that you and I don't have much of. She had power. Lying there in that bed, unable to move, unable to see, unable to hear, unable to talk to anyone, she had incredible power. Paradoxically, then, even though the problem of suffering is the greatest objection to the existence of God, at the end of the day, God is the only solution to the problem of suffering. If God does not exist, then we are locked in a world filled with gratuitous and unredeemed suffering. God is the final answer to the problem of suffering, for he takes us into the incommensurable good and redeems us from evil and brings us eternally into fellowship with himself.